Hello and welcome to another random video. This is the front K-frame steering assembly and suspension setup out of a 1996 Dodge Neon Coupe. It's going to be the same on the sedan and very similar for many other front-wheel drive rack and pinion steering vehicles. The reason I'm making this video is to show some of the common problems that can cause death wobble in small cars with rack and pinion steering. I've been going back and forth with a person on YouTube, and they've been asking me what might cause death wobble, and I figured this would be a good opportunity to swap out the lower control arms on my car for these ones with aftermarket polyurethane bushings to stiffen up my suspension, and give a brief breakdown of how your steering actually works, as well as your suspension, and the things that can fail and cause the problems that would lead to death wobble of the steering wheel. This right here is the steering shaft that goes down from your steering wheel into the steering rack. As you can see, when I turn it, it moves the tie rods in and out, which turn the wheels. The reason it's got this accordion style shape here is because in an impact, this can collapse and allow the steering wheel to move in and down away from your chest so it doesn't impale you. Inside this boot is the inner tie rod, which I showed on an earlier video on the 95 Dodge Neon where I replaced it. It's a ball and socket joint, very similar to this one, but instead of the socket and ball being vertical like this, they're horizontal. So the socket is over here and the ball is right here, and they fit together and move in and out like this. That allows the suspension to move up and down, if this wasn't so stiff, up and down like this without binding and still being able to steer, the same way that this ball allows the suspension to move in and out and up and down without binding while the suspension is traveling. This here is what's commonly referred to as a CV, or constant velocity shaft. This is what comes out of the transmission and drives the wheels. Normally there's a second cup on this side with a shaft sticking out with splines on it. That goes into your transmission. That's what drives your front tires through the spindle or wheel hub, depending on how you call it. There is a spline shaft inside here that doesn't actually drive anything on this side. The hub assembly right here is what's driven by that CV shaft, as you can see. There is a bearing inside here with an outer race that this holds and an inner race that this slips inside of. And when the bearings in between the two go bad, this can start to have movement up, down, in, out, whatever, and that can cause abnormal play in your steering. When this bearing fails, it can also cause your wheel to fall off if it goes long enough, because this will start to pull apart and it will rip this shaft out of the transmission if it goes bad enough. Okay, this you can kind of see right here. See if I can flip this over. This here is what's commonly referred to as an anti-roll bar or an anti-sway bar. What that allows the car to do is when one suspension side moves up, this suspension assembly is forced up by a bump, this bar ties it to the other side. Well, if that side isn't trying to go up at the same time, then this bar will actually twist and act as a spring to resist that. Let's see, what next? Right here you have what are known as control arm bushings. This red thing here, this is the polyurethane part. This is why I'm swapping these control arms over. Normally cars don't have polyurethane bushings, they will have rubber bushings. When those wear out, which they do, the control arm can actually move more than it's supposed to, which will allow the tire to move separately from the steering and can cause the death wobble as well. The tie rod will, or the sway bar will only clunk when the tie rod ends break. That's usually what happens, is this bolt that goes from top to bottom will break and allow this to move separately of the suspension. That can be a clunking that you'll hear in the front end. There are some cases where the sway bar will break, especially on late 90s to early 2000s Chevy or Pontiac Grand Prix. I guess is a common problem because that's the only vehicle that I've ever seen it on. Never seen any other ones break the sway bar itself. but it can happen. Let's see, this right here would be what are known as lower ball joints in the control arm. It's the same ball and socket joint that would normally be on your tie rod end, but it's not designed to move nearly as much. And what this does is it allows the spindle to pivot back and forth independently of the control arm. When this wears out, the bottom of the control arm can, or the control arm itself and the spindle can move independent of each other and cause a hammering motion against the steering as it bounces and moves back. That can also be a source of death wobble. The reason I'm trying to point this out is because these are things that you need to look for when you're trying to sort out what death wobble might be coming from. Another thing can be bent rims, but that's usually less likely unless you've run into, say, a curb. And then the last thing would be the struts. The shocks, is what most people know them by, but in this case they would be called struts because they have a coil spring over them and they are part of the assembly that holds the suspension to the car instead of being independent of it. They can fail at the top and start to widen the hole at the top of the strut body that the strut shaft comes through, and that can cause problems. If that starts to move independently of the rest of the suspension, the top of the tire can move in and out. It's usually unlikely to see that, but it is possible depending on how old the vehicle is or how hard it's been driven. But those are just some of the things that you can expect to find as far as death wobble in a front-wheel drive car. But I'm going to get busy tearing this thing down to swap it over into that one so that I have a bit of a stiffer suspension when I'm throwing it around corners. Well, there we are. The other control arms are finally on the car. I'm sorry about the finger. I don't know how well that's going to show up in the dark. There you go. You can kind of see it. I even swapped over the sway bar, even though I could have just reused the old one and swapped the hardware, but I felt might as well do it the easy way. But now, if you're thinking about changing your rubber bushings for polyurethane bushings, I should warn you now, if you like the way your car handles, don't do it. The polyurethane bushings dramatically change the way your car handles. The front end will not move nearly as much going over bumps. Your suspension will not cycle nearly as much. Your shocks won't work as much. Your springs won't work as much. That polyurethane will resist that up and down movement, so the whole car will bounce every time you go over a bump until you hit something hard enough, or unless your vehicle is heavy enough to actually compress that polyurethane. On a Neon, that's not really the case very often. So your front end will do a bit more moving. However, there are benefits as well. Going around a corner, you won't notice nearly as much body roll. Going off camber in a turn, you won't feel the front end push down and try to walk sideways nearly as much with the flex of the suspension. Bump steer will be significantly reduced because the front end is so tight that it just wants to stay going the same direction. But if you're thinking about doing this because you have severe vibration in the front from death wobble and you're not sure where it is, this might be the thing for you to try, because these bushings will wear out and they will get sloppy, and the only real way to fix that is to replace them with something better. In my case, I went with polyurethane. In the previous owner of this car's case, they went with new rubber, and well, the polyurethane bushings are much older than these rubber ones are, and they're still in great shape. So that should give you some idea of the durability. Thanks for watching.